This video is for part 1 of chapter 3, Alfred Adler, for PSY 230, Personality Theory. In this chapter, we'll be making a departure from the more controversial approaches of both Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung in Alfred Adler's individual psychology. Adler, like Freud and Jung, is considered a psychoanalyst. However, his approach is widely seen as a bit more relatable and practical, and in some ways has some meaningful, it's in some ways a meaningful predictor of what's coming down the road in the form of humanistic theories, as well as some of the later developing trait approaches. So some personal background on Adler. He was born in Vienna, so we have a Northern European person. Like Freud, he was from a Jewish family. As a child, he was ill a lot and found himself to be intensely jealous of and in competition with his older brother, who was very physically fit and athletic. He sought and received his medical degree, again, a commonality with Freud and Jung. And you're starting to see, at that time, that was the way in to the study of psychology, was through medicine in Europe at that time period. His practice, though, at first was not related to psychiatry and not directly to psychoanalysis either. He was an ophthalmologist. He also practiced general medicine. He turned to psychiatry later as his interests started to shift. He became involved with some students of Freud's and was, at that point in time, fairly defensive of Freud's work. He found his approach to psychotherapy particularly compelling. He, at the beginning, was also in basic agreement with the general ideas that Freud was proposing. He rose to the highest leadership roles within the Viennese psychoanalytic world, which was a very tight-knit world. And he became a leader there. In that leadership role, though, he started to, as his own theory started to mature, as his ideas became more divergent from the traditional Freudian party line, though, he found that his own ideas, his own work was running afoul of the tendency within the Viennese psychoanalytic world to fiercely defend Freud. So he broke apart from that society and founded his own. And this was pretty common among this group of neo-Freudians and people who were still very strongly allied with Freud. Jung broke with the insider group and went on his own path. Adler did the same. Karen Horney, who we'll study next week, did the same thing as well. It was somewhat commonplace for the people who followed in Freud's footsteps to be very to treat each other in a very competitive way. So it's in some ways not surprising that Adler left as well. He also saw different ways in which theory, his personality ideas, his psychological ideas, his treatment ideas, could be applied more broadly outside of the realm of treating individuals who are having psychological problems. He was very interested in how you could improve education and the training of teachers. And he also founded what he called at the time child guidance centers, where he was attempting to mitigate educational problems that kids were facing, which also then bled over into behavioral problems as well. He came to the U.S. Largely because of Nazism, and because, he was in a Jewish family and he was very well educated. That was two strikes against him in terms of being at risk of being sought by and killed by the Nazis. So he started working in the U.S. and was moving in that direction of working in the educational sphere and working in child guidance centers as well. Unfortunately, he died in 1937 while he was on a lecture tour in Scotland. But his work remains influential, and I've been seeing in recent years a bit of an uptick in people who are citing his work and researchers who are using some of his ideas as foundational to their own work. Now, there's a fairly long list of principles associated with Adlerian theory. The major ones, your authors cite four major principles in the system as holism, which we'll have to talk about what that means, the unity of the individual's style of life, which refers directly to some sort of organizing state of personality, the idea of social interest or community feeling, and the importance of being goal-driven. He argued that having goals and expectations is a really critical component of human experience. Now, this idea of goals and expectations, these are very cognitivist ideas, and many have argued that Adler's description of expectations and goal-directed behavior are direct kind of precursors to work of people like Bandura and other cognitive theorists who later then incorporated similar ideas into their theories. He believed that individuals, their primary motivation, because he disagreed with the Freudian emphasis on strictly sexual drive and sexual motivation as so critically important, and instead he argued that people want to master themselves, they want to master the world by being able to pursue their own goals and succeed. Now, he wasn't necessarily saying that everybody's power hungry. In certain translations of Adler's work, it sounds exactly like that he's talking about us as really clearly power hungry. But while some people may behave that way, he feels it's more complex than that, being a power hungry despot is a pathological pathway to take. He felt that still, though, people, especially when they are challenged, have an innate desire to become more, to master the challenges that come their way, and to keep building toward goals that they have. So he adds to this, and again, this kind of goes counter to that notion that some people who criticize Adler's work have, that he's just describing us as power hungry. He stressed that in order to be successful human beings, he argued that there are many, many social influences that are of importance, and the ones that make us the healthiest, the most self-satisfied, the most fully developed, are those that are connected to social interest. So those that give us a sense of community, of being in this together, of having concerns for others. Now, this idea that Adler pushed is a precursor to much of what the humanistic psychologists like Rogers and Maslow, who we'll meet later in the semester, very similar to what they argued. The bottom line is that life for human beings, it involves this kind of steady march toward more and more successful adjustments to the demands of the world. He also felt in equal measure that a life well lived is one that involves cooperative interaction with other people, and it involves a certain selflessness, giving of yourself for the greater good. Now, as with all of these presentations, I do have some embedded videos. Remember that if the audio is not easy to hear, and our first three theorists here have accents that may be very unfamiliar to you, I do embed these videos directly onto your D2L page, and they're on the playlist on YouTube.
The socially mistaken pattern is built up in the first 4 or 5 years. Mostly we find as reasons for it imperfect organs, or that the child had been pampered, or that we find hated children is among orphans, sometimes illegitimate children, ugly children, not wanted children, and so on. This pattern is fixed and can be changed only if we are able to convince this child about the mistake, or later in life. Therefore, we could eliminate the mistakes in this pattern, either in prevention, to educate the family how to educate children rightly, or we could make the school an instrument of the social progress, to recognize the mistakes in their beginning and to accomplish more social interest among the pupils. Later in life it is more difficult, and it must be an individual treatment, how to convince such a person and how to change him. In this way, we are sure that the key of the individual psychology is the most important and worthwhile key, and we can guess much better, as with other methods, what is the mistake made in the childhood and how to correct it.
So, and I'll give you access to the full video. I'm only going to use part of it here. What you hear there is, he starts off with statements about what can set kids back. So when development is challenged, it's often in the form of what he calls organ inferiorities, physical problems. Remember that he as a child had many, many health problems, was often held out, had to spend much of his time in a sick bed. So he felt that rather acutely. He also talks about children who have been too pampered, who have been too protected by their parents, as well as kids who are orphaned, kids who have other kinds of challenges that set them back, that make them psychologically unbalanced in a variety of ways. Then he shifts to a discussion of how is this corrected? And he really demonstrates an interest here in wrapping this into the education of the family and rebuilding the focus of the family and the child who is struggling in the direction of social interest. So he's making this proposition here that, things can go wrong in early development. That is true. There are some concrete reasons how that typically happens. He argues that the solution is not so much in the one-on-one with the child as it is with the family and the child, moving that child in the direction of greater and greater cooperative social interest. So we need to start with this idea of inferiority, because that's really where the theory starts. He refers to this idea of organ inferiorities, which are basically physical weaknesses or incapacities. It could be quite obvious, physical disabilities, illnesses, other kinds of weaknesses, though, that are more subtle are certainly possible. So you can look at organ inferiorities, which he then says are reflected in psychological conflict. So, Adler is true to the psychoanalytic model. Just like Freud and Jung, underneath the surface there is psychological conflict. Having physical weaknesses, having emotional reactions to those weaknesses represents a challenge. and that means it represents a psychological conflict. So humans want to compensate for those weaknesses. He argues that that's what drives us to overcome these weaknesses through work, through training, through exercise, as an example, but also through other kinds of diligence and effort, which can often include, creative action to overcome the things that are supposedly standing in our way. Beyond what he argued were actual physical problems that people have, disability or illness, for example, he also talked about feelings of inferiority, which are often referred to as an inferiority complex. That's a phrase you've probably heard because it's one that's often used in everyday speech. Feelings of inferiority are basically you having a sense that you are weak in a particular area of your behavior in comparison to others, that you should be better in particular areas, that you could be better, that you could achieve more. And those feelings of inferiority, again, they represent psychological conflict. We want to be stronger. We want to show mastery. But when we feel inferiority, then that can rise to the level of representing a conflict. It can cause us anxiety. It can cause us sadness. It can cause us to become angry, for example. Children, he argues, are naturally, by their nature, challenged by a sense of inferiority, particularly as they move through early childhood. They're smaller, they're less confident, they're less capable than the people who surround them all the time, great big adults, older siblings, and so on. As they get into school, they may be faced with teachers, with older kids in school, kids who are simply bigger and stronger than they are. So children are routinely exposed to this heightened sense of inferiority. And they, he argues, have a biological drive to try and compensate for that sense of inferiority. Taking power is, for Adler, is something that is innate. So we want to overcome, we want to take power and not show weakness, but there's a struggle there. Wanting to compensate for one's inferiorities may lead you in the direction of acting out and behaving inappropriately. So, early on, children are going to do things in order to try and compensate for their perceived inferiorities that, run afoul with the rules. So they may push around another child, or they may fight back when their parents try to get them to behave in a certain way. And they need to be socialized to embrace this drive toward compensation in a more appropriate, socially viable way. So compensations are anything that we do, whether we're children or adults, to try and overcome what we perceive to be inferiorities, or things that are actual weaknesses that we perceive in ourselves. So we make these compensations. These compensations are both behavioral but also psychological. So we're attempting to find ways to overcome those inferiorities so that we feel that deep sense of mastery. When we are making progress, it is when we're growing, it is because we have grown through these attempts at compensation. So kids, think about little kids who, when they finally are able to reach a cupboard door without help, and sometimes it involves the use of a tool, and they figured out how to bring that stool from the bathroom into the kitchen so that they can climb up on that stool, open that cupboard door, and take the cookies down by themselves. The joy and satisfaction for that child is completely undeniable. So in that little example, that's what Adler is really getting at here, is that when we overcome problems, when we solve a problem, we feel good about it. When we've made a goal for ourselves and we achieve that goal, and especially if there's some suffering involved, in achieving that goal, we feel good about it. Now, early in his theoretical work, he did make this suggestion, some of the ways he was describing this drive towards superiority, and this is where he gets the criticism about seeing human beings as pretty power-hungry or Machiavellian at their base nature. So he talks about aggression broadly, and so he's including not just sort of hostile types of aggression, but also assertiveness, how we in English would use the word assertiveness. He wraps that into his conceptualization of aggression. So he describes as aggressive, attempting to overcome obstacles without delay. So really intensely, assertively overcoming obstacles, challenging them head on yourself instead of allowing someone else to take care of it for you, is what he means by aggression. Now, in some of his writing very early on in his theorizing, he does pull in this idea of hostilely taking your obstacles on. But as the theory matured, it became much more clear that he was talking more about assertively, personally taking responsibility for your obstacles and working hard to overcome them. This assertiveness, this aggression, may become what Adler called a will to power, which is an interesting phrase, and it comes out of being translated from the original language in which Adler wrote, and it's a hard concept to translate. Think of it as a deeply psychological drive state. Think about a time when you have been intensely motivated to do something hard, something maybe physical, maybe it's you're training for a sport and you're physically pushing yourself to the limit to achieve a goal, or if it's intellectual, learning a new skill or learning a new body of material and you suffer to get there. Think about what that emotional state felt like, simultaneously painful but also deeply rewarding. He felt that that's where aggression and the drive toward superiority came from, and he described that as will to power. Will to power in Adlerian theory is a very global motive, and he argues that all human beings have it. So when we face either real or perceived inferiorities in our own behaviors, we have a natural inborn motive to overcome them. And he argues that, the end state, the end goal state that people are driven by is this idea of perfection, this idea of superiority. Sometimes Adler's model, though it has its psychoanalytic roots and is built on a notion of psychological conflict, some psychologists like Salvador Matti, who's also a personality theorist, argue that Adler's approach is really a precursor to what are called perfection models, where researchers or psychologists like Carl Rogers or Abraham Maslow, we are born and we have a purpose, and that purpose is something we have to discover. So we're born like an incomplete puzzle, and our job as good human beings is to grow in the direction of completing the puzzle, despite the fact that all the parts aren't there. So we have to compensate for the missing pieces and still work hard toward that perfection and completeness. Definitely Adler was moving in that direction with his argument here. So our motivation is in the direction of trying to continually improve ourselves. Now think about people and people who are already quite accomplished, but they keep driving toward new tasks, and compare them with other people who appear to be stuck, who just really aren't doing much with their lives. And then also think about what your impression of them. We tend in Western culture, in Western European culture, in the US and Canada, we tend to very strongly value personal success. and the movement in the direction of just, continually becoming more, continually becoming better than what we are right now. So once we accomplish one task, we set another one, and another one, and another one. So this is a very Western culture kind of idea of being very driven toward superiority and success. Now, at the same time, he argues, within this, healthy drive toward improvement, he's going to link it directly back to social things, such as social interest, altruism, and so on. So superiority, it can either be healthy or it can be seriously unhealthy. Some individuals can take a deeply psychopathic approach to this striving for perfection. Some individuals could become highly controlling, manipulative, cold, and dogmatic in their approach to striving for perfection. And they hurt people along the way. That's a deeply negative psychopathological approach. In a positive approach, the person essentially, forgive the phrase, is using their power for good. So they're using their continuous drive for growth and enhancement and toward being more. They're using that in the service of social interest and altruistic outcomes. Adler used this concept of life goals as a kind of organizing principle in the theory. He said that people tend to have sometimes socially prescribed life goals, but they also tend to function on an individual psychological basis by coming up with goals for themselves that they can then focus on. Life then is influenced by, these life goals are influenced by personal experiences. So if people get a bad start in life, they have a great deal of, say, physical problems that interfere, or if their parenting is flawed, or if their social environment is problematic, that can influence the kinds of values, attitudes, personality traits that they form early on. So you're getting a sense here of, where does psychopathology come from? Where does neurosis come from? It can come, just like Freud said, through bad parenting or inappropriate parenting, but it can also come from broader things, through cultural messaging, through attitudes that are formed through personal experiences, and so on. The formation of life goals, he argues, under ideal circumstances, even under ideal circumstances, building life goals comes from the kind of lessons that kids learn when they attempt to overcome natural challenges associated with feeling inferior or feeling insecure or feeling helpless. He feels that is unavoidable. And if parents interfere and pamper their children, in other words, they don't let them fail, they don't let them ever know that there's a possibility for insecurity, if they don't let them ever feel helpless, that they won't try to compensate. And if you don't learn to work hard for things, that's a problem. So you could have, two bad outcomes here. You could have either the pampering parent or the really ridiculously harsh, punitive parent who doesn't support the child's efforts at early compensation and punishes them for their failures when it's not their fault. So parenting can go wrong in a couple of different ways, either over pampering or under supporting the child. Healthy development is when parents take they engage in an appropriate level of hands-offness. So they let kids struggle within reason so that they learn how to persist, so that they learn how to strive. And the success that they experience when they've had to struggle to succeed, in Adler's opinion, is far more valuable. Life goals eventually become a way for people, as they move through childhood into adolescence and even later in adulthood, we continue to form life goals. Life goals become kind of the architecture of our defense system, because regardless of how old we are, we always have physical limitations, and the older we get, those physical limitations sometimes become quite profound. Or if we suffer a grave injury, or if we have an illness that changes us. So we're always in a struggle against feelings of inferiority or feelings of powerlessness. So life goals kind of serve as this psychological construct that helps us to feel in control of some aspects of what we do in our lives. And it kind of gives shape to who we see ourselves as. Life goals are always going to have some unrealistic elements. Adler felt that a life goal isn't worth pursuing if you know undeniably that you're going to be successful. That's basically just saying, I'm only going to set my goal where I already know I'm capable. So he felt that in some ways your life goals, in order for them to be meaningful psychologically, have to be just outside the boundaries of what you're currently quite sure you're capable of accomplishing. That way you have to push yourself. You have to become more in order to achieve them. So sometimes one of the dangers is that life goals can get a little too intense and a little too out of line with reality. Sometimes he argued this happened when parents or other adults in a person's life put unrealistic, unattainable goals on you, and you internalize them. Then they become overinflated, and the feelings of inferiority become too intense for you to manage. That can be a source of neurosis. In healthy functioning, life goals are just unrealistic enough to keep us motivated toward achieving more, toward learning more things, keep us motivated in that direction of persistent growth. The ultimate goal is to move through this process where you've got this innate drive toward growth, early on. We're talking infancy, toddlerhood into early childhood, where you're having to deal with the fact that you're small, that your body doesn't quite do what it's supposed to do. And then later in childhood, starting to feel senses of inferiority and how to deal with those. When we are in the process of kind of trying to conceptualize who we are, who we're growing toward, what kind of goals we have, we may experience exaggerated emotions. Think about where you are in your life right now. You may be thinking about various kinds of career possibilities. You may be thinking about various trajectories your personal life within your relationships is going. The feelings associated with that uncertainty can be big and hard to manage. Sometimes people, if they have a dimly identified, not well-fashioned final goal, or if a goal has been supplied for them that they don't own fully, like let's say you have really, really strong-willed parents and they've said to you from the time you were born, you're going to do this and you're going to be this. And you internalize that through your childhood and you hit school and maybe it's not going all that well. The feelings associated with that work, because the goal is there, you don't perceive it as your goal. The emotions are going to be big. You may shift your emphasis towards simple personal gain and be driven toward personal success for its own sake. That's a false process. And he argued that that's a path of unhappiness, of neurosis, of disinterest in other people, and a path that is unsatisfying. When people clearly perceive a final goal that is theirs, that they understand, that they have chosen, that hasn't been supplied and forced on them, then they have normal, rational, realistic feelings of incompleteness. They know what the goal is. They firmly perceive it. They clearly understand it. And they feel, I'm not there yet. I really want to be there, but I'm excited about it, not afraid of it. Over here, with this inauthentic final goal, the feelings of fear and anxiety and hostility become quite strong. On this side, where you have a final goal that is yours, that is clearly perceived as yours, then the person turns in the direction of social interest. And that leads to what Adler referred to as real success, because it is grounded in social interest. It's grounded in the fact that the world around you needs you and needs your contribution. That leaves you feeling successful, not in a personal superiority sense, that, yeah, I've gotten the goal. That leaves people, personal superiority in Adler's mind, leaves people feeling eventually empty, that the work, the effort, the challenge wasn't worth it. So they often would come to him in that state after working and working and working and saying, I've made the goal, but I still don't feel fulfilled. Well, his argument would be that this lifetime has been in pursuit of a false goal or an ill-defined goal, whereas in the healthy pathway, you have striving toward a goal that is inherently rewarding. When things are inherently rewarding, they lead to social interest. Social interest leads to feelings of pride and success that is authentic in its form. So to pull some ideas together here, people strive toward a final goal, or I like to think of it as a combined set of goals that represent a final goal that's either in a neurotic form of personal superiority or what Adler would define as success, which is a socially embedded experience of achieving your final goal. And he very much thought that, people are at their best when their lives are lived in the service of something bigger than just themselves. He felt that having this sort of final overarching goal is a structure that defines who you are. So therefore, it defines your personality. And from an outsider's perspective, it would clarify why people do what they do. So in other words, it makes your behavior understandable. So if you can dig under the surface and find that final goal, even if it's a goal that's based in personal or neurotic superiority, you would understand the person's behavior more fully. So we have to bring in another concept here. The final goal is in many ways a product of what Adler called creative power. One of the things that makes humans human is their capacity for coming up with new ideas, new choices, new thoughts, new behaviors, and it's that creativity that they can use to overcome hurdles that are put in their way. It's the way they grow, is through this creative power. In essence, especially once you're beyond childhood, you are literally creating your own personality. You can either do it in a way that's selfish and egoistic, or you can do it in a way that's in service of the wider world and your community, the community in which you're embedded. Now this description of the personality that we create through the exercise of creative power, on a purely descriptive level, Adler described it as a style of life. So lifestyles, I'm sure that's a word you've used in your everyday speech, but a lifestyle or a style of life is the constellation of habits, behaviors, ways of thinking, ways of feeling that characterize how people pursue their lives and pursue their life goals. It is in many ways an integrated set of traits, but it's also an integrated set of ways in which people adjust to and adapt to their lives as a whole. So, how do you approach social interactions? Each individual is going to have, filtered through their style of life, a particular way of interacting socially, for example. Now, your authors bring in another theorist here, who's an Adlerian, Mazek, who lays out some of the elements of the style of life as an extension of Adler's work, talks about the self-concept, which is conception. It's a cognitive model of who you are from your own point of view. Then there's the self-ideal. This is what you think you should be. And the difference between self-concept and self-ideal, when we get into Karen Horney's theory next week, she's going to make the same basic argument here. There's a self-ideal that we internalize, partly based on the ideas of others, but also through this pursuit of challenging inferiority. So as children, we see lots of people around us all the time who are more powerful, more accomplished. We construct out of that experience a self-ideal. We also have this sort of profound image construct, if you will, beliefs, a set of beliefs about what the world is like. So we start to construct for ourselves a schematic system, a cognitive system for perceiving the nature of the world, the nature of other people. It's a belief system that we use in order to make predictions about what other people are going to do, how they're going to feel, what the world's going to be like, what kind of challenges am I going to face in the future. So we develop this image of the world. When we get into Maslow's theory, he's going to make a similar argument down the road. Now, just to draw some comparisons here, self-concept is in some ways related to the Freudian idea of the ego. The self-ideal is in some ways similar to the Freudian idea of the superego. However, those similarities are pretty superficial. Certainly, Freud had a different conceptualization of where the self-ideal would come from. He felt it came from emerging recognition of the fact that we are sexual people with a particular gender identity. Adler really didn't pay much attention to that. He put it strictly in the context of, what am I now? What should I be in terms of my accomplishments? What I am capable of doing in the world. He also added this notion, and this is sort of split off from that idea of a superego, that people have to develop ethics. They have to develop ethical values, your own personal code, for example. And since he's so grounded in this idea of social interest, that shouldn't be surprising to you, that by the time we mature and become mature adults, or even young adults, we should have a personal code. What is right and wrong behavior? What is right and wrong behavior for me? What is right and wrong behavior for others? And so on. As you know by this point, I'm very fond of graphics. I'm a very visual thinker. I found this image on Google Images of the style of life tree, where you have various attitudes towards life tasks. Health and appearance might be one, social and economic position of family, parental attitudes, family constellation, gender role. All of these are possible roots, experiences from early on, from which your overall style of life grows. Some Adlerian psychologists talk about 5 basic attitudes towards self, toward difficulties, toward others, toward sexuality, and toward life. Adler didn't speak of those directly, at least not in your chapter. He alludes to them in a variety of ways, but you can think about them as extensions here. This root system below the ground, he saw those as influences. And then as the tree grows, as the person grows and develops over time, you're becoming prepared to meet, and the graphic is cut off here, This word is challenges. You're becoming prepared to meet challenges. And then as the trees grow out and leaf out and person becomes more mature and more fully formed, the style of life will have ramifications in relationships with other people, in the work that you do, in your intimate relationships. And he saw those as the three basic areas of life tasks, is how you conduct yourself with others, how you conduct yourself in your work, how you conduct yourself in your intimate relationships with your chosen others. Now here's an example. Again, I'm very fond of graphics, and I apologize. My dog is being very noisy in the background, and I don't really understand what she's doing. Anyway, here's an example. You have Michelle's style of life is basically insecure. So if we go to childhood, at age 3, her parents would say, be a big girl like your sister, and they're really pushy about it. At age 4, mother's saying, see how that little girl is being? Try to be like her. And is pushy about it. In 1st grade, she's not invited to a party. She sees that as a failure. In 6th grade, she was picked last for dodgeball twice. Sees herself as a failure, not living up to the already big demands that her mother had made. In junior high, she ran for president, didn't win. In high school, she wasn't asked to the prom. She applied to grad school, wasn't accepted. So her life in this case, excuse me, is a series of failing to live up to expectations. And her challenge, given that her style of life is basically insecure, if she came to therapy at that point in time, she would have to learn new strategies for overcoming that kind of personality structure that's completely built on the experience of failure. Failure that was imposed on her by parents, failures that she experienced in childhood, with social relationships, and then experiences even in adulthood of more failures. Creative power in the Adlerian model is this idea that as humans, we aren't passive. And this is something that where Adler really diverged from the Freudian party line. Freud felt like we were basically at the mercy of our biology, of our impulses, our instincts, and we were simultaneously kind of at the mercy of the ineptitude of our parents. Adler gave us more power, more control. He saw us as not being passive in our interactions with the world. Even as children, he didn't see us as particularly passive. He felt that, we had weaknesses and we could be damaged by parental interactions, but he still felt that we were quite powerfully built to struggle and to overcome. When we are pushed down this line, and the pushing is generally from ourselves, but we're pushed in the direction of forming life goals, lifestyles, and what's called a schema of apperception. All of this is essentially us using our big brains in a creative way to find workarounds, how to get to the things that we want for ourselves. So we construct a pattern of behaviors. We construct a life goal. We construct a schematic representation of where we're going. He sees that as basically a creative process that we engage in, because you have to use imagination in order to get where you're going. You have to use imagination to even conceptualize a life goal. All of that is creative. Also, when you're young, but even when you're aging, you sit in the place where you are at the current moment. And if I ask you, sitting where you are at the current moment, where are you going to be in 10 years? What's it going to be like? That's a creative thought process. When you start down that path of where am I going to be in 10 years, you have to imagine, where might you be? And that's a creative process. Adler argued that this creative power within the personality, or the self, you could call it self or ego. He argues that becomes the source of energy. So creative power is essentially Adler's replacement for the concept of libido. We are driven to conceptualize ourselves in a future point in time, and it directs us within the environment that surrounds us. In this quote, he states, every individual represents both unity of personality and the individual fashioning of that unity. That means that you can describe individual personality in terms of its overarching structure. You can also think of it as process. So it's the person creatively forming who they are. Now we'll see echoes of this idea of creative power in both the theories of Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow down the road. So kind of file that away in your head for when we get there. And that concludes part 1 of Alfred Adler.